Oh God, why bother? Maybe one of the reasons to bother is because one of the deepest intrinsic instincts and desires of the human heart, regardless of what we believe, is to know who we are and to know where we're going. I want to talk to you about this question, oh God, why bother? And it actually raises an interesting foundation on which this question is asked. Oh God, why bother? We could actually replace that oh God with anything. Why bother with anything? Sure, why bother with God? Why bother being a Christian? But also, why bother with atheism? Why bother not believing in God? And so it begins to get clear when we think about where we all are, regardless of what we believe, that we all believe in something. We all believe in something. Now, when you look at the definition of the word faith, there's a huge misunderstanding of this definition. The word faith is accurately defined as belief in something that you cannot deductively prove. You believe in something that you can't deductively prove. So you take a step of faith. You trust that some proposition is true, even though you can't deductively prove it. Now, what does deductive mean? Deductive means prove it beyond any doubt at all, in the way that we can deductively prove that 2 + 2 = 4. Now, the honest scientists among us, whether they're Christian or atheist or whatever their worldview is, will tell you that the only things you can deductively prove in human reality are mathematical truths. Mathematical truths because you can deductively prove them. You can show the logic, you can show the reasoning. There's no scope for error when you're proving mathematical truth. Everything else, every other kind of belief, we do by faith. The belief that the earth is round, the belief that the sun goes around, that doesn't go around the earth, but we go around the sun. These are all statements of belief or statements of faith that we cannot deductively prove, but we have reasonably strong evidence on which to believe them. That's why we bother with them. That's why we bother with these truth claims that we don't know 110% to be true, but we're pretty confident based on the evidence that we have that these things are true. So we are doing a thing that all human beings do, and it's how we know absolutely everything in our lives, from the existence of our children to the fact that we actually hold the jobs that we go to every day. We are doing something called inference to the best explanation. Inference to the best explanation. Physical scientists do it, social scientists do it, and no scientists at all. They all do it too. Inference to the best explanation. You all came in here and none of you checked the structural integrity of the chairs on which you're sitting. None of you lifted up and checked which company made them and Googled that company to see if they were credible, checked their listing on the stock market to see if they had crashed or they were being sued for making malfunctioning chairs. None of you weighed yourself this morning and then checked with this company what weight the chairs could actually withstand. You didn't do any of that. Because you had a reasonably held belief, you had a faith position that these chairs would hold your weight. You were doing inference to the best explanation. And it's a pretty good inference. You're all sitting there pretty comfortably now. So your inference was correct. But the thing we have to get past is this myth that there are certain things in the world that we can know for sure and need no faith about, and then other things that we can't know at all and we need faith about that. There's a famous story told, a true story about Albert Einstein, right? The great Nobel laureate, physicist, genius, mathematician. And Einstein is on a train in Germany. And he has lost his ticket. And so when the ticket checker comes along, it's like a young kid. The ticket checker is like some 16, 17-year-old kid doing some kind of an internship on the train. And he asks him for his ticket. He doesn't know who Einstein is, doesn't recognize him, even with the crazy hair and everything. Doesn't recognize him. And he says, sorry, sir, I really need to see your ticket or I can't let you stay on the train. And so Einstein is like looking around, looking under, gets on his knees, he's crawling around under the chairs, trying to find his ticket, looks in his jacket, he can't find it. And this kid's like, sorry, sir, I can't let you stay on the train unless you give me your ticket. Then his supervisor comes along, the conductor of the train, and sees who this is, the great Albert Einstein, slaps the kid, takes him to the side and says, don't you know who that is? This is Albert Einstein. This is actually the smartest man in the world, the most brilliant human that's ever lived. And then the kid's like, I'm so sorry, sir. I'm so sorry, Professor Einstein. Don't worry about your ticket at all. And then they leave. The ticket checker then walks back through the train about 10 minutes later. just to do a check, a sweep of the train. And he sees Albert Einstein still on his knees looking for this ticket. And he says, Professor Einstein, don't worry, you don't need a ticket. We know who you are. You don't need a ticket. We know who you are. And then Einstein looks at him and says, son, I know that you know who I am, but I don't know where I'm going. Oh God, why bother? Maybe one of the reasons to bother is because one of the deepest intrinsic instincts and desires of the human heart, regardless of what we believe, is to know who we are and to know where we're going. And I would suggest, certainly in my experience, but also as I look across the cities and the communities that I've lived in, that I've worked in, and that I've studied in, unless we first know who we are, it's impossible to know where we're going. We are so busy trying to get to where we're going. We work so hard to get where we're going. Sometimes we don't stop to think about who we are. And we don't stop to think about important existential questions like this. Oh God, why bother? And so in that context, I want to talk briefly about 3 reasons why it's right and correct and in our interests to bother with God. The first is that truth is indispensable. The second is that suffering is unavoidable. And the third is that happiness is not enough. Truth is indispensable, suffering is unavoidable, and happiness is not enough. Now, truth has an interesting history. We have an interesting relationship with truth as humankind. We used to just come up with ideas that we thought to be true, tried to prove them, tried to propagate them and advocate for them. And we developed systems of thinking that we call ideologies. And this is where all of the isms came from. All the way from Platonism to Confucianism to liberalism to Marxism to capitalism to communism. All of these isms are basically systems of truth that we have developed. But unfortunately, because of our internal brokenness, because of the struggles we have within ourselves to be at peace with one another and to be at peace with ourselves, what ended up happening was these isms became bases for conflict. And we see wars, and we see devastation, and we see carnage that arose because different groups of people with different truth claims couldn't resolve or dialogue about their different truth claims amicably. And ultimately, the 2 world wars in the first half of the 20th century are the saddest but most perfect examples of this. People with different truth claims, different ideas about what was true, that went to war over it. Nations, empires, went to war over it. And there was massacre. And in the wake of these world wars, all of humankind was thinking, we have to find a way to avoid this ever happening again. We have to find a way to stop this kind of suffering and massacre and conflict and war. And a small group of people that we now refer to as the postmodernists, they had an idea. They said, maybe the only reason we have this conflict is because everyone's walking around with their truth claim that they want to impose on everyone else. All truth seems to be a grab for power. It seems to be socially constructed. And then the postmodernists said something that no one had ever said before that, or at least had never written about before that. They said, we've looked into this, guys. We've worked out the source of the conflict. The source of the conflict is the human assertion of truth. Therefore, truth does not exist. And if you read these philosophers like Wittgenstein and Michel Foucault and Jacques Derrida, that's exactly, in a broad sense, what they were saying. That truth does not exist because it's all socially constructed. All truth claims are a grab for power. And this is where the dispensability of truth began, with postmodernism. Just another type of relativism. There's no such thing as truth. Now we live in a post-truth world where it's kind of like the successor to postmodernism. The postmodernists were saying there's no such thing as truth. The post-truth thinkers say, look, there may be such thing as truth or not, but it doesn't really matter. What's more important is your feelings. This is a generation increasingly that is thinking with its feelings. Not thinking with facts, not thinking with reason, not thinking with evidence, thinking with its feelings, thinking with its emotions. And some aspects of this postmodern, post-truth, relativistic type thinking seems to appeal to our hearts and minds. This idea that everyone can kind of have their own truth, that all truth claims are equally valid, that we should all just believe what we want to believe and respect each other's beliefs. Now, Large parts of that I agree with. I worked in politics, I worked in government. We want harmonious societies. And we do want people to have the freedom to believe whatever they want to believe. But if we take that to the next level then, and to say, because people should have the right to believe what they want to believe, therefore all beliefs are equally true, then we make a huge logical mistake. There's an Oxford professor, and he wrote this book called Free Speech while I was doing my postgraduate there. And he describes two kinds of respect that we should have for each other when we have different beliefs. Recognition respect and appraisal respect. Recognition respect is recognizing that everyone should be able to believe whatever they want as truth. Appraisal respect is where we actually take the content of what they believe and we interrogate that content to see if it's actually true. We test the truth value of the content of the belief. It's got nothing to do with the person or our affection for them or our regard for them or their right to believe it, but we don't get to a place where we say, because I respect your right to believe in whatever you want to believe, therefore what you believe, the content of it, is equally as true as any other belief. Otherwise, you get to a place very quickly that is pretty obviously illogical, where I say 2 plus 2 equals 5, you say 2 plus 2 equals 4. If we're genuinely postmodern, post-truth thinkers, we have to say both of those beliefs are equally true. They're just different ways of looking at reality. And we know that that doesn't work. We've all heard the story about the 4 blindfolded men standing around the elephant, right? This is the postmodernist mantra where they will say one blindfolded man is touching the leg of the elephant and says, I think this is a tree. Another one is touching the tail and says, I think this is a rope. Third one is touching the trunk and says, I think this is actually a hose. Fourth guy is touching the side of the elephant and says, no, I think you guys are wrong. I think this is just a wall. And so says the postmodernist, the skeptic, the post-truth thinker who says either there's no such thing as truth or we can never know truth. They say, you see, these guys all just have a different understanding of reality. They just have a different perspective. They're just relating to the ultimate reality in their own way. And that's all well and good. They should have a right to relate to it in whatever way they want. But we're not going to pretend that they're all equally correct. In fact, in that example, the central example of postmodern ideology, the most ironic thing is that they're all wrong. They're all completely wrong. Not one of them gets anything right about the actual truth. The truth is that it's an elephant. So truth is not dispensable. We see it practically. We see it logically. But even if you're not with me on those examples, we see it at a pretty base level philosophically. Because, and I've said this before, the claim that there is no such thing as absolute truth is a truth claim. Whenever anyone says to you next time, you know there's no real such thing as truth, there's no real truth out there, you ask them, is that true? They have to say one of two things to that question. They have to say yes, it is true, in which case they're acknowledging that there is such thing as truth. Or they have to say no, that statement wasn't true, in which case they're acknowledging that there is such thing as truth. There's no way to deny truth without affirming it. So we know by the base definitions of logic that absolute truth exists. Truth is not dispensable. That's why it's worth bothering with what we believe in. Whatever our belief is, it's worth investigating. Because you know what? Truth can stand up to questioning. Truth can stand up to questioning. In fact, truth is the only thing that can stand up to questioning. It's the only thing that ever has been able to stand up to questioning. So doesn't it make more sense if we're trying to build a culture of truth, where we love each other, we respect each other, we are gracious towards each other, we protect each other's rights to believe whatever we want, but then we come alongside each other and we create spaces, and we create intellectual avenues, and we create channels and conversations and events like this where we can actually question different truth claims and work out what's true. And some people say, well, how do you actually know what truth is? Well, it's actually a much simpler answer than we think. Plato, long before Christianity was even Christianity, Plato said, human beings find out truth by following the evidence to where it leads. That's it. That's the only way we ever have known anything. By using two things, reason and evidence. It's not complicated. It's the way you found your way here today. You used reason and you used evidence of what you saw and where it was. It's the way we know that while we say the sun rises, the sun doesn't technically rise. We shift so it looks like the sun rises. You use reason and you use evidence. It's how humankind has found out every single piece of knowledge that it's ever known, using reason and evidence. So why can't that be the case for God? or indeed the non-existence of God. Whatever the proposition is we believe, we should be able to test it using reason and evidence, and if it's true, it will stand up to reason and evidence. Now, here's the interesting thing when we pivot now briefly to the Christian message, before I go on to the second pillar. The person of Jesus, he does something unique in comparison to all other worldviews and philosophies. They all say, this is true. They point to propositions. This is true, this is true, this is true. The atheists, the proposition is, God does not exist. This is true. It's a true proposition. Jesus doesn't make a proposition in that sense. He points to himself and says, I am the truth. So straight away there is a uniqueness. What Jesus is saying, if he's right, what he's saying is that truth is at its primary core not propositional in the way that we know it to be with our everyday lives. It's actually personal. Jesus is saying, I am God himself as a person. That's what we Christians mean when we say Son of God. We mean God as a person. The Father-Son thing is just the closest relationship, we could think of to help us approximate that. But he's actually God as a person. And he's saying, I am truth. Not this is true, I am truth. So truth is not dispensable. But if Jesus is who he says he is, truth is also personal. And that distinguishes the Christian worldview from anything else we've ever seen in human history. Second reason why we should bother with God is that suffering is unavoidable. Suffering is completely ubiquitous. It's absolutely everywhere. In fact, every single one of us here, no matter what we believe, is dealing with some aspect of suffering in our lives right now. It's intrinsic to the brokenness of our world and the brokenness of us as individuals. So what that means is, in response to the question, why bother with God or why bother with anything? The human need to deal with suffering, to avoid it, to defeat it, is on every human heart. And so we naturally reach out to solutions for our suffering. Every worldview out there, to its credit, has a response to suffering. And it kind of has to, otherwise it can't even be taken seriously. So even for it to qualify as a worldview for us to scrutinize and interrogate, you need to deal with suffering. It's like the most common thing in humankind, right? It's intrinsic to the human heart. We just don't like it. It upends the whole post-truth thinking. Oh, maybe for me, suffering is a bad thing, and maybe for you, suffering is a good thing. You should just deal with it. It doesn't work, right? The aversion to human suffering is absolutely everywhere. So what then are the responses of these different views of reality, these different belief systems? Well, they all have different views. Some will tell you that there is a God out there, but you're not allowed to question him about your suffering. You just got to live with it. You just got to deal with your suffering. God has no moral obligation. There's no moral link between you and God because it's not personal, it's not relational. Truth is propositional, suffering is just reality. So just shut up and deal with it. Some will tell you that suffering is your fault, that all the suffering you're going through right now is 100% your fault. It's because of something you did, either yesterday or earlier in your life, or indeed in a previous life possibly. But all suffering is brought about by the person that is experiencing the suffering. Others will tell you that the problem with suffering is that it grows out of human desire and connectedness to people and to things. So the reason you're suffering is because you desire too many things. You are in relationship with too many people. You have to meditate yourself out of those things. You have to distance yourself from the physical reality and the relational reality in which we live. You've got to just push away from everything. And once you disconnect entirely, to the point where you disconnect even from yourself and your consciousness, then you can't suffer anymore. And then we come to the atheistic family of worldviews. And there's different kinds of atheism, but one thing they will all say is that when it comes to suffering, your suffering is meaningless. And all honest atheism has to acknowledge the meaninglessness of suffering. Because there is no God, there is no meaning. Not just in suffering, but in anything. There's no meaning in work, there's no meaning in families, there's no meaning in human existence. We are just time plus matter plus chance. And paraphrasing Richard Dawkins, who does occasionally have these glimpses of philosophical honesty in his atheistic writing, he says, in a world of time plus chance plus matter, all we can expect is blind, pitiless indifference. And in that kind of a world, some people will get rich, some people will be poor, some people will get raped, some people will get killed, and you won't find any reason or meaning to any of it. It just is what it is. We're just time plus matter plus chance. DNA neither knows nor cares. It just is, and we dance to its music. That's Dawkins. So when we look at all of these responses to human suffering, there's no choice. You don't have a choice whether or not to suffer. Sure, you have a choice of how you deal with that suffering, but you only have a limited number of choices on the table. And in my personal view, both intellectually and experientially, none of those are compelling. None of those compel the human mind or the human heart. None of those would be worthy. I wouldn't be able, with a straight face, to present any of those responses to suffering to a young mother whose child has just been diagnosed with leukemia, or to a father with 3 children who's just lost his job, or to someone who's just had their fiancé cleaned up in a car accident by a drunk driver. So what then is the Christian response? It is not a God who sits back and says, don't talk to me about it. It is not a God who tries to give us theories of how to think ourselves around the suffering or ignore the suffering or just accept that we have caused the suffering ourselves. It is a God who comes into the world as a person, takes all of the suffering and brokenness of humankind onto himself, allows himself to take the penalty to acquit humankind of its debt, of its moral imperfection, of its existential imperfection, of its experiential suffering. On a cross, he's crucified on that cross, brings all suffering under his control and destroys it and does away with it. And now he's a God who's willing to reach out to us and suffer alongside us. Every other worldview in some way, shape or form will say, try this, try that, think about it this way, think about it that way. Jesus says no. Suffering is real. The world is broken and you are broken. Take my hand, we're going to go through it. We're going to conquer through the suffering. So truth is indispensable, suffering is unavoidable. Thirdly and finally, oh God, why bother? Because happiness is not enough. Happiness is simply not enough. We have talked ourselves in our international, globalized, market-driven economy that's anchored in consumption, that all we need to do is pursue happiness. But no one stopped to think for a moment whether happiness should be the ultimate objective. The problem is, while we're doing that, if we anchor our identity in that, then happiness is all we're going to get. Whereas the reality of happiness, to be blunt, and given that we don't have all the time in the world here, happiness is quite simply far too pathetic a reduction in the objectives of the human heart to make our final goal. Happiness is just a feeling. But if happiness is all we're looking for, then you probably wouldn't bother with God. You'd still struggle with suffering in your life, so that would probably be more difficult. It would probably be difficult in itself to find happiness on your own. But even if you did, the best you could hope for is happiness. Because if all we shoot for is the feeling of happiness, best case scenario, that's all we're going to get. But the reality of the world, the vicissitudes of life, the rough and tumble of what we all go through are such that even that happiness is fleeting. Because we build it on things that are unstable. We build it on things like jobs and children and families and the approval of others and the number of Instagram followers we've got and the number of Facebook friends that we've got. We build it on reputation. We build it on sex. We build it on alcohol. We build it on drugs. We build it on technology. They might get you some glimpses of happiness along the way. Hey, they might make you happy the whole time. I still haven't seen that, but they might make you happy the whole time. But you're still reduced to being left with nothing but happiness. And then we look at what the Bible says, what the Christian response is. And God says, happiness. Is that all you've got? Is that what you think success is? Is that all you're looking for? I want you to have so much more than happiness. I want you to have this thing, this word that you only find in the Judeo-Christian ethic. You only find it in the scriptures. You only find it offered by Jesus Christ. And it's so unique and unusual and confusing to secular society that even the major leading dictionaries of the world don't know how to define it. This thing called joy. In the secular world, they've reduced joy to a feeling so they can better make sense of it. And you have to. If you kick God out of the picture, the only way to define joy is just a lot of happiness. But in the Bible, joy is not a feeling, it's not emotional, it's ontological. It's actually not part of how you feel, it's part of who you are. Because in the Christian message, what God says is, I'm not really interested, nor should you be all that interested in how you feel or what you think or what you say or what you do. I'm more interested in who you are. Who you are is the most important thing. And that's why when we say yes to this person of Jesus, when we say yes to this offer of relationship that God gives us, this free offer of relationship, it transforms who we are. then from that ontological transformation, what we say and do and think and feel naturally do start to change. As a natural outworking, a natural byproduct, you almost don't have to try. In the same way that mango trees naturally grow mangoes. They don't have to try very hard to grow mangoes. But if you're an apple tree trying to grow mangoes, that's going to be tough. That's like trying to find joy without God. But if you come to God, you accept the ontological transformation. You accept this person of Jesus into your life and into your heart. Then you are anchored in joy for the rest of your life, this one and the next one, into eternity. And then happiness just becomes like a little bonus, a little cherry on the sundae that sometimes comes and sometimes goes. But if someone serves you a sundae and then takes away the cherry on it, you're really not that stressed. You're really not that stressed because that's not what you came for. That's not what your identity is anchored in. You're anchored in the real sundae. You're anchored in joy. Something that only the person of Jesus Christ can give us. So why should we bother with this God? Because truth is indispensable and there's evidence to support the truth claims of Christianity, but more importantly, because this Jesus distinguishes himself by saying, I am the truth, not just this is true. So it's propositional truth, it's also personal truth, but ultimately it's relational truth. And that comes to life, that relational truth, when we talk about the second thing, because suffering is ubiquitous. We need a way to get through suffering in our life. We've constructed some ways that seem to work okay some of the time. Jesus gives us a surefire way. This God who loves us so much that he came and died for us, suffered for us, and now is willing to suffer with us, and gives us a hope of an eternal future with him where there's going to be no suffering at all. And thirdly and finally, because happiness is not enough. That's why we should bother. Because happiness is simply not enough. We've all experienced happiness. And we've all experienced that happiness be taken away for whatever reason. And if that's what we're devoting our lives to finding and anchoring our character around, that's all that will ever happen. Life will just be a series of moments where we're happy, followed by a series of moments where we're not happy. All the while dealing with the ubiquitousness of suffering and having to ignore the indispensability of truth. The only place we can bring all of these three realities, these three tensions in every other worldview, but perfectly cohere in the message of Jesus Christ, is if we are willing to say yes to him. Yes to that relationship. And it's a free offer. It's another one of these words the dictionaries outside of the kingdom of God don't know how to define. This word grace. Unwarranted, unmerited love and favour. Something none of us deserve. That God reaches out and offers us this relationship, offers us forgiveness of our sins, of our shame, of everything we've ever done that was wrong, and everything we're going to do that was wrong. Prospective, unconditional forgiveness. You won't find that anywhere else. Through this God, he came into the world, called himself truth, and proved it by taking all the suffering onto him, going to the cross, dying for us, rising again from the dead, leaving propositional evidence, pointing to his personal evidence, ultimately anchored with the relational evidence. But the relational evidence only gets off the runway if we are first willing to say yes to that relationship. And then look at the offer of this person of Jesus Christ that claimed that he was God himself and died for you. And see if honestly there is resonance. Are you willing to follow the evidence in your heart and the evidence out here to where it leads?